At one point, in a warehouse of roughly 3,000 to 5,000 square meters, not only did my client's goods disappear overnight, something else happened too. A boat engine dropped and hit the concrete. Damage was done. And now the question is, who's responsible for that damage? In cases like this, we're dealing with a carrier who later turns out to be a bogus operator or simply a criminal, one typo in an email address. Normally it's logistics, and that tiny difference was all that set the criminal apart from the real legitimate carrier. Today we've got 5 stories for you, 5 stories of fraud, but we'll also talk about how to prevent these scams. We'll find out how criminals operate in the transport industry and what steps we can take to protect ourselves. Let's dive in. Hello and welcome to the Transport Shipping Success podcast. In today's episode, we're talking about dishonest practices and losses. So yes, we'll touch on insurance, but in a very engaging, tasty way, because we'll be sharing real stories, and along the way we might learn how to avoid some of these problems ourselves. Our guide and expert is insurance broker Dawid from Polonica Broker. Hi there. Hello everyone. Dawid, how many clients do you actually have? Well, it's a bit hard to count on the fingers of one hand. I deal with insurance in many different areas, starting with property insurance, motor insurance, and transport insurance as well. So no, my clients aren't just carriers. I've also got clients who run manufacturing businesses and happen to operate transport on the side. That multi-layered approach is very useful. In what way is it useful? Because losses can occur at the intersection of different types of insurance. Transport, property, sometimes motor. It all depends on the situation and the nature of the damage. One of the more common schemes used by fraudsters is impersonating various companies. Do you come across this often? Do your clients say this is happening widely at the moment? I wouldn't say it's the key issue, or that most transport losses involve fake carriers. Also, by the time a claim reaches us, it's usually the scams that were successful from the criminal's point of view. So I don't have data on how many attempts fail. But from talking to clients and insurers, I know this isn't a marginal problem. These losses happen fairly often. To be honest, I've got information from one insurer that a single client, during a 12-month policy period, had around 12 to 15 such incidents. The sum insured allowed for payouts for the first 2, but that's a separate issue. So yes, this stuff does happen on the market. I think it's worth breaking down the issue of the fake carrier into 3 elements. First, you've got fraudsters who outright impersonate a carrier to obtain the goods, either at the point of collection or when they're securing the transport contract, using forged documents and references to pass themselves off as a legitimate company. Second, you've got the real fake carrier, a legally operating company with its own history and documents that gets bought out by a new owner, who intends from the start to use it for criminal activity. In that case, the carrier only later reveals itself to be a bogus operator or outright criminal. And the third aspect, which I think is also worth spelling out, is impersonating the consignee, right? So it's a bit of a reversed scheme. And here, it's definitely important to pay attention to any changes to the delivery location. It's worth verifying this already while the vehicle is en route, because there are cases where criminals simply intercept the load. Before our meeting, I asked you to prepare a few of the most interesting cases. Interesting in the sense that they help us avoid similar situations in the future. More as a warning. And I can see you've got your notes there, so let's grab the prop. I honestly can't wait to hear what kind of stories you've brought, and I wondered where you'd start. Whether you'd go, colloquially speaking, with the biggest one, or whether you've just picked something from this deck of shady practices. I think we can refer back to what we were just talking about. So I think we can start with that case involving impersonation of a legitimate carrier. One of my clients experienced this, and it happened at the stage of, to be honest, looking for a subcontractor. So we're talking about the transport contract phase. Given the volume of shipments, it's perfectly normal in transport to use subcontractors. My client did the same. He found a company on a freight exchange that appeared to be legitimate. And this is a client who pays a lot of attention to verifying who he works with. So it wasn't a situation where he just picked the first carrier he saw. He carried out proper checks. He verified the license, checked the insurance policy and whether it was active with the insurer, checked the company registration documents in the relevant country, since it wasn't a Polish company. So he basically did everything he reasonably could, exactly. And the only difference, discovered later during the claim investigation, was a single typo in the email address. Normally, it's logistics, and that tiny detail was the only thing that distinguished the criminal from the real carrier. During the claim settlement process, my client also contacted the genuine carrier. He did even more thorough verification then, and managed to get hold of their actual phone number. It happened to be a foreign haulier, and they had no knowledge whatsoever of any transport they were supposedly meant to perform. So at that point, it was clear that this had been a criminal operation. That's one of the cases. The second case relates to what we mentioned earlier. This time it was a legally operating carrier. A company with its own history, reputation, references, license, insurance policy. Because if you're running a normal business, those documents are essential. But the company had been bought out, I think about 3 to 6 months before the incident. And at the time, my client didn't know this. These facts only surfaced during the claims process. The company had gained credibility in my client's eyes because these were their first jobs together. They'd successfully completed 2, 3, maybe 4 transports, and everything seemed perfectly fine. Everything seemed fine. So at first he was given smaller jobs on shorter routes, and later, as trust built, he was given 2 full truckloads, and these were high-value loads. Each was worth around 150, and at some point, those 2 truckloads simply never reached their destination. That's how we found out that the goods had been fraudulently taken. I can say that the case ended positively from the insurance perspective, but not under the carrier's liability insurance, CMR. And the next 2 cases I'd like to mention, which I think are very interesting, are also somewhat connected to transport. What do you mean? I mean this connection with other types of insurance. My client wasn't a carrier. He was a seller of iPhones. and he also sold his products in Italy. Because of the crime risk known in that region, he was worried about theft. Right. To reduce the risk, he decided to rent a kind of on-hold warehouse in Italy, a temporary storage facility. The idea was that once the invoice was paid, the goods would then be delivered from this closer location within Italy to the final customer. I assume the waybills were also addressed to that warehouse, and that's exactly the key to the whole situation. Let me finish the story first. This setup had been working for about 6 to 9 months. Not a scheme, just standard business practice. And then, one night from this warehouse, which was around 3,000 to 5,000 square meters, not only did my client's goods disappear, but there was a burglary, full stop. My client had cargo insurance, insurance for goods in transit. And he was convinced that this policy would cover situations of this kind. But we have to remember that cargo insurance protects during the transport process. From the viewpoint of the documentation, the transport ended at that warehouse, and any further movement from that warehouse to the final customer would have been a separate transport altogether. That's why the cargo insurance didn't respond. Not directly anyway, because here too the story had a happy ending, which I'll get to in a moment. But in this specific example, the goods should have been insured under a property policy at the new location, meaning the Italian warehouse should have been declared as an insured location in the property insurance. I'll just add that this case also ended positively, because all three parties, the insurer, the broker and the client, reached a settlement. Of course, the settlement also involved the client committing to insure with that insurer for the next few years, but he did recover part of the financial loss. You know what? I really don't want us to lose that thread about flexibility, because what you just said is quite interesting, that you can negotiate and that it's not always a black and white, you didn't follow every procedure, so no payout. We're simply not able to verify absolutely everything. So there is some flexibility on the insurer's side, of course, because the nature of insurance is not always clear-cut. Often, the interpretation of certain words determines whether a claim will be paid or not. And what's more, a given sentence or clause can be interpreted completely differently depending on which side you're on. The insurer will interpret it in a very defensive and narrow way, while we, like in my client's case, might interpret it more broadly. For him, the transport was only complete once the iPhones had been delivered to the final customer, let's say a wholesaler. To him, that intermediate point wasn't the end of the journey, but in reality, that was the end of the transport. It wasn't an interim customs warehouse, nor a typical stop in the logistics chain. The transport officially ended there. And that last example, the one you just started to describe before I interrupted you, what was that one about? This last one is very interesting. I still don't know how it will end because it's a fresh case from one of my clients. The client is a carrier and had a job transporting an oversized load, specifically a boat, because it's a specialist product, the cargo securing, the actual fastening of the boat onto the transport vehicle, was handled by the shipper. My client, the carrier, was responsible for delivering the boat to the port in Gdynia, and at the entrance to the port, there are these speed bumps. Speed bumps, exactly. These raised humps, yes. All right, let's call them raised humps. These raised humps are designed to slow vehicles down. And when my client's driver drove over them, the boat's engine lowered itself, struck the concrete, and was damaged. And now the question is, who's responsible for that damage? On the one hand, the carrier must deliver the goods from point A to point B and is held in a way to a quasi-strict liability standard, meaning he has to prove that the fault lies with the shipper. On the other hand, the shipper is a professional who has done this thousands of times and secured the cargo properly. And nothing like this had ever happened before. What's more, it turned out that these engines are double secured against exactly this kind of incident, and yet it was the middle engine that dropped, the one that theoretically should have been the best protected, because it was also held in place by the side engines. So we'll see how the case ends, but it clearly shows that a carrier's risk is very high and that transport damage claims are difficult to handle. And in the early stages, when we're just receiving initial information about what happened, it's really hard to assess whether we'll be able to defend the carrier against the claim, or whether, despite everything, compensation will have to be paid. And on top of that, there's the issue of the carrier's liability versus the scope of the policy and the insurer's liability. And tell me, in your view, could it be an argument in the client's favor if he shows that he has always secured this type of transport properly? Nothing had ever happened before, and then suddenly it did. Does that kind of reasoning matter in these cases? It depends who my client is, right? Because if my client is the carrier, then of course my arguments will lean towards saying that under normal, proper securing of this type of cargo, this shouldn't have happened, especially if we know that these speed bumps are a standard part of the route. It wasn't a surprise. Exactly. The carrier didn't change the route. This was completely normal for this type of journey. But on the other hand, if I were also the broker for the shipper, then their arguments would also be completely valid. If the engine manufacturer designed 2 layers of protection, hydraulic supports plus an additional safety mechanism, and if this wasn't a new kind of transport for them, meaning they'd done this kind of securing many times before, it was a standard procedure. A standard, yes. Then that's absolutely an argument you can use to defend yourself. Listening to these stories, honestly, it makes your hair stand on end, because it makes me realize that no matter what you do, there's always a risk of falling into a trap set by a fraudster. Of course, you can try to prevent it. And the examples you gave show that these companies really were doing everything they could. Even the Italian case, for instance. I think what's really important is maximizing the chances of detecting such fraud or attempted fraud. Even here at Visline, we try to maintain standards that keep both our forwarders and our business partner verification team extremely alert. And I agree, those typos, they really do come up again and again. We catch them too. Lithuania, Italy, where the URL suffix differs just slightly. These are subtle differences. LT versus IT. And it's really easy to get tricked by someone pretending to be an Italian or Lithuanian company from the opposite direction. But since we've reached the conclusion that we can minimize risk but never eliminate it completely, this is where the role of the insurer comes in, and how we insure ourselves. So I wanted to ask, can you insure yourself in a way that actually addresses these challenges? Working together with Visline, we've developed a clause, the one you have in your policy, which directly covers the issue of the bogus carrier. Naturally, the structure of this clause may differ depending on the insurer. One insurer will agree to a broader scope, another to a narrower one. One might agree to cover the fake consignee, while excluding, for example, companies that operate legally and only later turn criminal. signaled. Or they may include the most common scenarios we've talked about. Of course, the clause also imposes a whole series of verification duties on Visline regarding your subcontractors. Sometimes this has to be done for every transport. Sometimes, if you've been working together longer, it's enough to do it periodically, say once a year. Verification checks, registration checks, licenses, insurance policies, drivers, and so on. And if it turns out that despite fulfilling all these obligations, a crime is still committed, then the insurer declares that they will pay the compensation. Naturally, the clause also limits the insurer's liability quite often. For example, if your overall liability limit is 350,000 euros, this clause may cap this specific risk at 100,000 euros. Another restriction might be a higher deductible, meaning a larger self-retention on the carrier's side. Well, better something than nothing, of course, but an insurance policy can include far more extensions than people often realize. It's worth considering things like alcohol use, intoxication, other psychoactive substances, loss of driving qualifications, for example. Even something as simple as a vehicle's technical inspection can become an issue during a claim and may lead either to a denial or a reduced payout, depending on the circumstances. So the mere word policy doesn't mean they're all the same. The transport industry has, in a way, forced carriers to have carrier's liability insurance. Nobody will release a load without it. But the type and scope of that insurance is not defined by law. It reminds me of private health insurance or international travel insurance. There's no obligation to have it. We can buy the cheapest option or whatever the tour operator throws in. And then when something unfortunate happens, it turns out we're entitled to almost nothing. Exactly. But I wouldn't want this conversation to imply that insurers are bad or malicious. If we sign a contract for medical expenses with a low limit that excludes chronic illnesses, and we have a chronic condition, and then go on holiday and end up hospitalized because of that condition, we shouldn't be surprised that the insurer refuses to pay. It's the same with carriers' insurance. Simply having a policy does not guarantee that the subcontractor's insurer will pay compensation. That's why it's so important to check not only that the policy exists and is active, but also whether the scope of coverage matches the transport being performed. Right. So to wrap things up, how do you choose a good broker? Someone who gives support, advice, someone you don't feel you're pulling against, not an enemy, but an ally, a business partner. How do you recognize a good insurance firm? I believe a broker should become, in a way, part of the client's organization. They should empathize with the client's processes, but also actively cooperate with them. Even though I studied logistics, I never actually practiced it. So the information I get from you, from Visline, is extremely valuable. Because from those examples, from your actual practice of sourcing subcontractors and other aspects of transport operations, I can identify risks that might materialize. So I think the key is cooperation and also trust. And trust is something built over years. We've worked with Visline for close to a decade now, so I think the trust level is high. But still, as you said earlier, surprises happen. The typos, the impersonation attempts, They keep coming. So it's crucial to view transport insurance not just as a box-ticking cost required by the client, but as something essential if something goes wrong. Especially if you run a sole proprietorship. You're liable with your entire personal assets. So the policy shouldn't be seen only through the lens of cost, but through the lens of what happens when a loss occurs. Because if these cases affect the whole industry, they can just as easily affect me one day. It's worth thinking about. I also think it's worth mentioning that a carrier's liability insurance policy can actually be a differentiator on the market. Very often, when speaking with Visline's forwarders, I hear, "That's all well and good, Mr. Dawid, but I simply can't find a carrier who meets the insurer's requirements, even when it comes to the required sum insured." So I think that for smaller carriers, looking at this element as a distinguishing feature, a competitive advantage, while at the same time gaining broader protection in case of a loss, is genuinely a very good path for them. I think that's a good conclusion and a solid hint at how to gain competitive advantage. And I'd sum up this entire episode, our whole conversation, with something like this. In reality, we can't protect ourselves against everything. There's no way to avoid certain problems entirely, but we can reduce the risk as much as possible. And internal procedures within a transport or forwarding company play a major role. Precise verification, patience, thoroughness, thinking things through, and above all, learning from those rather unpleasant examples. Another thing is choosing the right business partners. People you can, as they say, steal horses with. And as you mentioned, sometimes those 3- or 6-month-old companies try to gain our trust with small, low-value jobs, and then suddenly, bang. So the partners we've worked with longer are generally more reliable. But even then, you have to stay alert, because someone can always impersonate them too. And the third aspect is the insurer, or broker, who can give sound advice and sometimes offer non-standard solutions with broader coverage. In that case, we essentially avoid the costs of pursuing claims and, above all, the waiting time, because those losses often mean money frozen for months. Dawid, thank you very much. I think this conversation was a challenge, especially for me, because navigating insurance topics isn't easy. There are so many little loopholes, every word matters, and you really need precision and clear definitions. I'm glad you managed to explain it all in such a friendly and accessible way, and that you shared these stories. I'm sure it'll serve as a warning and a benefit to everyone listening. Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Goodbye. And thank you as well for listening. This has been another episode of the Transport Shipping Success podcast. I encourage you to check out the other episodes. You can find us on YouTube and Spotify. See you next time. The dubbing was generated by artificial intelligence.